Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL round number 3 and round number 4 overview and analysis video. This is of course going to be winners finals, as well as that third, fourth place matchup, the two teams that are remaining that have, made it through the lower part of the bracket as well. By the end of this video, we're going to know our top 3 teams in the LPL for this winter split, and we're going to know our semifinals matchup. And of course, with winners finals also being in this episode, we're gonna know the first team to officially qualify for grand finals here in the LPL. One of these teams will be one series win away from not only winning the LPL, but representing the region at the First Stand International Tournament. A lot on the line for every single one of these teams. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you expect to happen in these two series? Did it live up to your expectations, or were you a bit surprised by the outcomes? I will definitely be talking about what my expectations for these series were going into it, and whether or not I think the teams were better or worse than I was anticipating, but always curious to hear from you guys and hear what your thoughts are on that kind of stuff down in the comment section below. If you want to know my thoughts on how we got here, everything that's happened in the LPL so far in the winter split to lead up to this point, all of the group stage matchups, every single playoff matchup from round 1 or round 2, those videos in a playlist are going to be linked up in the iCard. You can check that out, but today is going to be talking about these two series that are really going to lead into the rest of the LPL year. I know that that's an obvious statement, but these are probably the two most important series of the year up until this point. Getting to finals is absolutely ginormous, and staying alive in the lower part of the bracket, this is really going to show us which teams are legit, which teams are going to be able to live up to some of the preseason or, early winter split hype that they've gotten, and which maybe aren't. So I'm excited. Hope you are as well. Let's get into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game in both of these series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie all of those games into a nice, neat little bow. So I'm excited to get into it. I hope you guys are as well. We will be previewing the semifinals at the end of this video, kind of talking about what we can expect from those lower bracket finals and who I think will be facing off in the grand finals in total, but most of today will be spent talking about these two series, and I've gone on for long enough. It's been like 2.5 minutes. Let's get into the actual content now, shall we? Our first series that we are going to cover in today's video is the big one. It's winners finals. I was so excited for this matchup because I really do think you can make an argument that these are the two best performing teams in the LPL at the current moment. Even factoring in, the fact that I think some teams were just not trying as hard in the group stage. We can see that with teams like Bilibili down in the lower bracket. I think these two teams really are legit. They have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that we have to take them seriously now. So let's get into it. It's the number 1 seed from Group B in JD Gaming taking on the number 1 seed from Group A in Anyone's Legend. Both of these teams went undefeated in their best of 5s in the regular season. Both of them had pretty difficult propositions in their group stage that they had to overcome. JD Gaming obviously had to beat Weibo Gaming to stay undefeated, and Anyone's Legend had to beat Top Esports. Both of those teams, I think, are top 5 teams in the LPL at the absolute worst. They are both incredibly solid, and even if Weibo obviously is already eliminated, they lost to one of the best teams in the entire tournament, and so it was just unfortunate scheduling there. But JDG certainly didn't have an easy road to get here undefeated, and AL didn't have an easy road to get here undefeated. Both of these teams took down legitimately good teams in the first round, although I think one of those matchups was significantly harder than the other. I think AL's defeat of Ninjas in Pajamas is a really good look for this team because I think it showed the well-roundedness of AL that I think could really play into this matchup, in particular against JDG, who's not a particularly well-rounded team, or at least they haven't been so far this year. And even if I do like JDG's win over Thunder Talk, that is a good team. I'm not trying to undersell Thunder Talk, but I think that they were significantly weaker than a lot of people were making them out to be. I don't think that matchup was nearly as hard as some of the other matchups that other teams had to overcome early on in the playoffs, and so I definitely think one of these teams is coming in a bit more proven. Add on to the fact that I usually don't talk about this, and I usually don't take this too much into account, but Anyone's Legend did win Demacia Cup. This is a team that has basically not lost all year. They have gone through the entirety of a preseason tournament, not dropping a single best of series. They come into the group stage here and they get drawn a really tough group with the team that they had to beat in the finals of Demacia Cup, and they walk out of that being undefeated in the best of 5s there, and then they come out in their first playoff playoff series and win that as well. They have not lost a best of series so far in 2025, and we're heading into March. We're getting really, really far into the winter split. I mean, there's only, at most 3 series left for this team, even if they lose here today, and they still have yet to lose. This is obviously a team with a ridiculous amount of momentum, and I think a lot of that can be attributed to the addition of Tarzan in the jungle. I think rightfully so, he's getting a lot of the attention. Obviously, everybody else on this team is certainly pulling their weight. You definitely don't want to discount what players like Flandre and Shanks and Hope and Kale have been doing for AL over the course of this year, and we will get to them in terms of this preview because there are a couple of players there that I expect to be pretty big factors for AL, but the big turnaround is because of Tarzan. If they don't have a jungler like Tarzan on this roster, they don't make the turnaround that they have over the course of such a short amount of time. Obviously, top side is different, but bot side of the map is the exact same as it was last year for this team, and they could not get over the hump. They looked good during stretches of time, but it took bringing in a borderline top 3 player in the entire region to really fix that, and that's what Tarzan is. I think there's a really strong argument to be made that he is the best jungler, not only in the LPL, but at times in the world, certainly in terms of consistency. I think he's right up there. Like, him and Peanut are very similar as players, and I think if you're gonna have conversations where Peanut is the #1 jungler in the world, I think Tarzan has to be in that conversation in the same vein, and I think he does it through, a style that's pretty ubiquitous. It's just kind of gonna work, as long as he's playing well, he's going to be consistent because his early game aggression can't really be stopped. I think when you add on top of that the fact that every single lane right now is just kind of winning for AL very regularly, especially top and mid, the solo lanes have been absolutely gigantic positives for AL, and if that's going to be the case, that's a very difficult team to beat. The reason I give them a lot of praise going into this series is because they feel like one of the most well-rounded teams in the entire world. Tarzan and Flandre are obviously taking a lot of the attention. Flandre's probably been the best top laner in the LPL so far this year, which has definitely been a shock after his tape from last year, but Shanks is incredibly good as a mid laner so long as he is mentally locked in and in good form. He can be pretty streaky, but he's on a good streak now. Hope and Kale were the best bot lane in Demacia Cup. They absolutely massacred that tournament, and they've been really good in the LPL. They've just gotten less resources than they got in that tournament. We know they can take over if they need to. Like, this is a very well-balanced team, and that makes them very difficult to deal with. And for JDG, on the other side, it's basically the exact opposite. This is a two-headed monster at the current moment, if we're being honest with how they've gotten here. Scout and Pace have been absolutely phenomenal for this team at the start of this year. You knew that this carry duo was going to be scary in some way, but the fact that they are as good as they have been is even a shock to me. Like, they've genuinely been maybe the best mid AD carry duo in the world, and that's been the driving force for everything that JD Gaming has been able to do over the beginning part of this year. Obviously, I think Paze has been a little bit more influential towards this team's success, but Scout has also been one of, if not the best mid laner so far in the LPL. He went up against Thundertalk and brutalized Satab. Now, Satab really struggled in the playoffs, but Scout is awesome, and Paze is awesome. The question is, can you get that kind of performance from the rest of this roster? When you're looking at players like Ala, Shun, and Missing, they've just not necessarily had those same kind of game-breaking takeover performances. Missing has definitely not been the same player that he was 2 years ago. Honestly, he struggled a lot at the end of last year. I think that went a bit under the radar. I think generally a lot was going wrong for JD Gaming. Yagao was receiving a lot of the criticism, but Missing was not very good for that team when they really needed to try and qualify for Worlds. That's carried over into 2025 so far. Shun obviously is pretty notorious for kind of running it sometimes. He's going to play super aggro, and when it works great, and when it doesn't, it works really poorly. And All has been fine on the top side. He's certainly not been a bad player, but he's not really been the upgrade that this team has been looking for. He's better than what Flandre and Sheer were last year, but Flandre right now on AL is just playing way better than Ala, and with these two switching teams in the offseason and them intrinsically kind of being linked in that way, and their career paths honestly looking dangerously similar in terms of the teams that they've gone to, it's hard not to compare them and look at that matchup that looks very Flandre favored right now. I think that is a concern for JDG. If Flandre and Tarzan are just going to be able to win on the top side, that's going to be a pretty unwinnable matchup for AL, but I think luckily for JD Gaming, the players that are the most flippy for AL are mid and bot, like Shanks and Hope. Hope in particular when he loses, he can lose hard. Like, he is definitely the kind of player that will bleed resources if things aren't going right, and we know that Shanks can be taken advantage of in really positive matchups. I think you basically have to play through those two members and just hope and pray that the rest of the team can survive. If Shun and Ala and and missing can just be good enough to allow Scout and Pace to be able to win. That's exactly what JDG has been this entire year. That's why they're undefeated in the LPL so far, again, outside of Demacia Cup. But for AL on the other side, their win condition is definitely just playing through their star players. If you can have a more well-rounded performance, chances are someone on JDG is going to slip up. But of course, the only way to know how this series goes is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get right into it. The winner of game number 1 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and this is such a typical AL game, just drafting for kind of the late game, the long term, whatever you want to say about their draft in this one. They drafted to be able to outscale and be able to have some proactivity in the back half of this game, and that's exactly what they had. They have a lot of ways to get picks on JDG, and I think especially after you see the Jace on B1, you see the Nidalee on B2, you kind of realize, okay, well, they either win or they don't, right? It's kind of up to JD Gaming whether or not they can get a big enough early lead to be able to really push this series, or whether AL is going to have a chance to come back into it, and that's why I really like rounding out this draft with things like Vi and Kai'Sa that just give you so much consistency in the back half of the game. You have a lot of versatile picks early on in this draft, things like Mbessa and Leona that can play into a lot of different styles, and even the Ryze. Ryze has been incredibly successful at Pro so far this year, like in the LCK and in the LPL, in the big leagues. Like, Ryze has been really good. Doenby and Showmaker, I think, have been the two that have really popularized it, but a lot of people are winning on this champion right now, and Shanks, just kind of picking it and saying, like, yeah, we trust that we can play around this Ryze in a way that makes it very difficult for JDG to be able to answer. We always have the Kai'Sa out in the late game. We have so much setup for her to either get picks or to win fights or to whatever, right? We just infinitely outscale Nidalee Jace on the other side of that matchup, and they were correct. For JDG, I'm not even criticizing the draft all that much. This was just their draft philosophy for game 1, which is let's try to pick something that can snowball the game out of control. Nidalee Jace is very difficult to deal with in the early game, and AL don't really have a lot of options. If they were up 5k gold going into 20 minutes into the game, they probably end up winning this game. They just weren't able to get that big of a lead, and as things went longer and longer and longer, obviously those champions became less and less relevant, which is a big positive for AL. So as much as people are going to criticize JDG investing so much into the early game, I don't even really hate it in this case if you are able to win. They just didn't, and so, it ends up being the case. But player of the game here in game number 1 is going to go to Hope on the Kai'Sa. The amount of damage he was able to put out, I think he did like 40% of his team's damage in this game. The Kai'Sa was always going to be a massive issue for JDG to deal with in the back half of this game. I honestly just don't really know what happens if you do get to 35, 40 minutes into this game. Like, that's why AL was able to, blow the game open so easily in the back half, because you have Kai'Sa and you have so much setup. You, again, have Leona, you have Vi, you have Mbessa, hell, you have Ryze Ultimate to get you into a lot of these fights. Like, there are just so many different ways to make it easy for Kai'Sa to get rolling in the back half of this game. You give her a couple of picks here or there. You get one random Vi catch with an ultimate, or Leona hitting an ult in the jungle to be able to pick somebody off and, donate a couple of kills over to Kai'Sa. This game just quickly snowballs out of control for JDG, and that's kind of what happened. I think Hope played better than that. I don't want to just say, like, oh, good Kai'Sa game, play towards the late game, Kai'Sa looked good. Like, I think he did a lot more than that, and they actually did play for the Kai'Sa win condition, something they haven't done a ton of in the regular season, at the very least in the group stage. They weren't playing for Hope nearly as much as they were in Demacia Cup, but it still looked really good. How do I not shout out both Flandre and Kale, who I think were fantastic setups this game? Flandre continues to just be an absolute menace on the top side. I genuinely do believe right now he is the best top laner in the LPL, and to go from what he was last year, which was a player that I was kind of advocating for not even starting on JDG over Sheer, to, being the most productive top laner in the LPL right now, it's pretty ridiculous. He's just absolutely on fire within the confines of this team. Kale was excellent on the Leona. I thought he especially had a really good game here as a setup piece. Shanks was really good on the Ryze, again, a champion that is performing well. Going into Jace, who most people consider way stronger, a champion that is not performing well at the pro level. And Tarzan, while he was a bit over-eager and did give quite a bit of gold over to, Paze and Ala, and, really kind of, kept JDG in it a little bit, a lot of the positives you get from Tarzan come from him being so aggro and so aggressive, and you just kind of have to live with the flip side of that coin sometimes. And so for AL, you're totally going to take it. Basically, everybody on this team did their jobs and was fine. This was a really good game number 1 for AL. And for JDG, your draft plan just didn't work out. Like I said, I want to sit here and blame a couple of players because I do think some of them played really poor and definitely gave a lot more resources over to AL than they needed to. But at the end of the day, if you're not, going into 20 minutes with the gold lead here, this game is pretty unwinnable for the team. There's just not a lot of ways for you to be able to pull this one back, especially when Kai'Sa does have a lot of gold and when Ryze has a lot of gold. When Ryze has basically won the mid lane matchup, that's kind of a disaster. That's worst case scenario. And that's what you ran into here. Scout is going to get dud of the game for game number 1. Jace is just not performing at the pro level. I've talked about it on this channel throughout every single region's playoffs, specifically the LCK. This champion continues to get prioritized very heavily in a lot of these drafts, B1 or R1 early on in these series, and he continues to lose, and he continues to not look effective, to not really deal damage, and to not be able to punish early leads. It's very, very strange. Like, Scout obviously didn't play Jace very well, and I think you could criticize Shun and Ala a bit for the aggressiveness in that same vein, but Scout was definitely the worst player on the Rift in this one, and I think he definitely holds a lot of the blame. If Scout's not going to play well, if Paze is going to be the only player on this team that you can rely on to carry, then they're not going to win any games against a team like AL. So Scout has to be better. I would really like if JDG go for something that's going to be a bit more, easy to execute. There is a lot of pressure on this team to win early with this draft, and again, they didn't, and that immediately meant that they lost the game, and I just think that that's not the right way to play out the early stages, but it is just game number 1. If you were ever going to throw away a game just hoping you could get this gigantic lead early, it's probably the first game of this series. If you can bounce back in game 2 and tie the series up at 1 apiece, obviously everything changes. Anybody can win a best of 3. AL very much wants to carry this momentum over, though, and win that game number 2 to be able to take that 2-0 series lead. Are they going to be able to do it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was JD Gaming. They are going to take game number 2. They are going to tie this series up at 1 apiece, and this was a much better game number 2 from them. I think you can look at a lot of different areas of this second game and point to big positives. I think generally speaking, this wasn't some gigantic draft gap. Again, I think game 1, pretty balanced in terms of the drafts. Both teams' identities are pretty clear, even if JDG's was a bit more time limited, but I think both of the teams have very clear win conditions in this one as well. You have a lot of options in the back half of this game for AL because you have Azir, because you have Renata ultimates coming in. Like, you have so many engage tools coming out on the side of AL that you have a lot of ways to punish mispositioning and just generally a lot of ways to force 5v5s if you're in a good spot. But JDG have so much agency on the map just in general that their early game should be more active. It should be a lot more proactive in general through the middle of the map, and I think a lot of that can be tied together by their jungle and their mid picks in this draft that I think really made everything work. I think generally the big takeaway from this was 2 main positions just completely gapping their opposition on the other side, that being jungle and support, who just were phenomenal for JD Gaming in this game, and, AL not really having an answer to it, but we can go ahead and talk about it here. Player of the game is obviously going to go to Shun. I didn't have to think about this too much. The Kindred was super essential towards JDG. The Taliyah pick on B2 already sealed it. This was going to be a favorite draft of mine. As you guys know, I'm really pounding the table at this point for Taliyah. I'm probably the biggest Taliyah defender in the entire world right now in terms of where she sits in the meta. If you're going to blind pick Azir, if you're going to blind pick Corki and put a mid lane, pick Taliyah and just move around the map. Fight over every single one of these objectives 3v3. Get your jungler super fed. Like, they can't do anything about it. Azir can't contest Taliyah in that regard, and that's what I think makes her such a good pick right now. Such a, really consistent pick, quite frankly, in almost any draft in the game at the current moment. Scout obviously played her well, but to compound that with someone like Kindred, who does love receiving those resources, you can move Taliyah out of that lane against the Azir because you know that Azir can't really punish it, and you can basically give free resources to your hyper carry marksman jungler. Like, this is just the perfect draft, I think, for game number 2. It's a perfect answer to something like Xin Zhao and Azir, because even if Xin Zhao is supposed to have early pressure, he can't actually act upon that because he doesn't have any lanes that are going to be in great spots. Now, the Gnar should be fine. The Ashe should generally be fine. I think both of them arguably are just in really dominant positions in the 2v2 or the 1v1 respectively, but if you lane swap out of those, Xin Zhao has nothing to do, and that's exactly what happened. So big credit to Shun. Also, it's worth noting Tarzan had a really bad game, and I think Shun took advantage of that. So, those are the big positives. Shun was great here. Missing was phenomenal. I think he's going to go undervalued for just how good he was in this game on the Nautilus. He was super essential towards setting up a lot of the mid-game things that really blew this lead wide open, that really ballooned the gold lead for JD Gaming. If Missing plays like this the rest of the series, it's not going to be close. One of their big, missing factors, pun entirely intended, is that he really has not been that guy for the past year and a half. half. If he's going to play like he did today, like that's a very different conversation to be had, because Pays did not need to step up and dominate. Scout did not need to step up and dominate. Shun and Missing stepped up and were the two best players on the team, and that really pushed JDG forward. So credit to them. Ollie was good too. You know, I'm not trying to discount him. I just don't think he was as relevant as everybody else. And then for AL on the other side, I honestly just don't think you were ever going to win this if you didn't survive the early game. Like, yes, the Azir and the Ashe and the Gnar and the Renata, like, they can get to the late game and they can be a bit of a problem. You have a ton of ways to force 5v5s if you're in an okay spot, but if you're not in an okay spot, you don't really have ways to survive that. And again, there's just more agency on the other side. I really hate blind pick Azir in this meta. I think it's super overvalued, and I think the only reason players are doing it is because it's Azir and they put in thousands upon thousands of hours on this champion. They just think he's the safest champion in the world to pick. He is super exploitable in a meta where you have to skirmish, you have to fight at 12, 15 minutes into the game, right? Azir is just not the kind of champion that can really survive that easily. Shanks wasn't the problem this game. I think Tarzan and Kayle were the problems this game, but I think Azir didn't help this situation. I think the draft generally put them at a disadvantage. Tarzan couldn't really capitalize on anything on the Xin Zhao just generally because of the map state, and that meant his champion was useless, and I think he got out jungled by Shun. Kayle was awful this game. He's going to get dud of the game for me here in the support position. I love Kayle. You might even say that he's like the biggest support channel darling that we have on this channel. I've been singing his praises for years, and I've been talking about how I think he can be a top 5 support in the world, like bare minimum. Perhaps he could be higher than that, but this was not a good example of that. Got completely outplayed by Missing in a matchup that he should have way more agency and pressure in, and he just didn't. It wasn't particularly good. Flandre didn't look nearly as good in game 2 as he did in game 1, although not all of it was his fault. Hope and Shanks aren't entirely to blame here, but again, I just don't love blind pick Azir. I think it was punished really heavily, and I think that that is going to be something I'm going to monitor for the rest of this series. AL is going to need to be able to adapt if JDG is just going to be focusing a lot on trying to control tempo, which is clearly their idea through their first 2 drafts. They draft, you know, Nidalee Jace and try to control the early game there, and here they draft Taliyah to try to get her out on the map and have control of that in that way. That's clearly the idea behind JDG right now, and AL clearly want to be a lot more 5v5 focused. We'll see which direction both of these teams end up going in. And, you know, obviously game number 3 to me is the most important game of the series when you're tied up at 1 apiece, because this really does dictate the tempo and the pacing for the rest of the series. If you win this 3rd game, all of a sudden a lot of the pressure is off, and you only have to win 1 of the last 2, which makes things a lot easier. So a big game number 3 for both of these teams. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Anyone's Legend. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1, take full control of it once again. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but the same narrative keeps playing out in all 3 of these games. JDG is drafting to have pressure and prio early game, and they either get it or they don't. They are playing to play entirely through the first 15 minutes of the game, and they either win or they lose. In this game, I think it's probably their weakest draft. I think that makes a lot of sense considering how many things that help that style are off the board in Fearless already up until this point, but AL is clearly investing into the opposite. I mean, they drafted Maokai, Poppy, Yone, like so many different tools for the later part of this game, even Lilia, right? Like you have so many different ways to capitalize on a team that just completely falls off on the other side of this map, unless you have a ridiculously strong split push for JD Gaming, which obviously they didn't, and AL was always going to be able to win every single 5v5 that ended up coming down to the later part of this game, and that's exactly what they did, and I think you could point to a lot of different members for that. I think that there are a couple of champions that are just incredibly strong into this draft in particular. I think the number 1 champion that comes to mind is Poppy, where it's just like, oh, you picked Poppy into Jax, Lee Sin, Ahri, Ezreal? Got it, man. Like, yeah, you got this one. Like, it's a pretty good game to play Poppy, and Broadcast gave Kayle player of the game because of that, but I kind of have to give it to Hope. I've been a big Jhin defender on this channel over the course of the last, I would say 2 years or so. Not so much this year. I think I'm kind of in alignment with a lot of people. I think generally people are higher on Jhin than they were the last couple of years. I don't think people are expecting him to be, you know, this hyper carry, like in terms of the damage he's outputting anymore. I don't really know why people were ever expecting that. He's going to be a lot more secondary carry, but can do like primary carry damage, obviously, if he's super far ahead. But there are some matchups that he just looks really good in, and I'm not going to say that Ezreal is inherently one of them, but this was certainly a game that went well for Hope, who is my player of the game. Like I said, just a really great performance from him. He's been awesome in this series so far. He's honestly been better than Pays on the other side of this, which is a huge contributing factor to why AL is up in this series at all. If he's going to be able to continue that, it's going to be kind of lights out for JD Gaming. They need Pays to step up in order to stay relevant in a series like this, and Kale was obviously a big part of that as well. Just a much better game number 3 than game number 2. I will say, Poppy, incredibly strong into this comp. Poppy in particular just completely shuts down Lee Sin, and it makes their early game basically non-existent. Like, it's very difficult for Shun to play this out. We'll talk about Shun because I think he individually also made quite a few mistakes, but, you know, this is just a really difficult game for JDG to end up winning because of that B5 Poppy. They just kind of got suckered into that pick and didn't really have an actual answer. I'm still not a big fan of Shanks just B1 blind picking his mid laner. I think that there are a lot of circumstances where that's going to be punishable, and just wasn't in this game. Like, the Ahri is not the champion that you would use to punish Yone. Tarzan was awesome. Flandre was fine as the Maokai on the top side. His job this game was to not lose and to not give Jax gold on the other side of this, and he did fine in that role. Overall, solid game for AL, but again, their mentality of just saying, like, you can have your early pressure. We're going to have more options the later the game goes, and we're going to try to play for 5v5s. Like, that is clearly showing up, and that is clearly working out for them right now. And JDG's opposite strategy of, like, we just want to win early. We want to have full control of what happens in the early game, and we either win the game or we lose the game from that front. It continues. This is literally 3 games in a row of that style, and, you know, unfortunately, it's just not working. I don't think it's been particularly consistent. Now, again, I don't want to put all of the blame on Shun. You know, you give and take with Shun, generally speaking. That's just kind of what you have to live with, but this is a hard game for Lee Sin to play out. Not only is Lilia going to be a bit of a nuisance in the mid game, we'll just say, surrounding a lot of these 3v3 objectives you want to take, but Kale shuts you off. Like, if Kale is there, it's over, man. Like, there's no way for Lee Sin to be able to play the game, and that's just, you know, a really difficult thing to overcome if you're Shun, and I think he played poor. That's why he is dud of the game, but he wasn't the only player who played bad. I think Scout is really underperforming in this series. You know, he was good in game 2, but losing game 1 in the way that he did, and then not being relevant at all in game 3, even being on the Ahri, like, he still should be able to move around the map and do something. He just wasn't relevant in any way, shape, or form. I think missing kind of reverted back to game 1 missing. Like, this felt more like the JDG we expected going into this series, and again, if they're just going to lose early, they're not going to be able to survive these games. AL understands that going 37 minutes is in their favor in this series, so, you know, I think AL has a pretty good game plan. JDG is either going to shake things up or they're going to double down, and it's either going to work or it's not. It's definitely going to be interesting to see throughout the back half here, but this is, you know, win or go to lower bracket for JDG. This is game 4. Can AL put JDG away and win the series in 4 games, or is JDG going to be able to pick up that game 4 win, show that blue side is still as strong as always, and push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was JD Gaming. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up the series at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5 here in winners finals. Obviously, this is best case scenario, both teams coming out and showing advantages and disadvantages, but JDG throwing away the early series game plan, saying, we're not going to try and play for the first 15 minutes. We're going to pick Zeri. We're going to pick Sejuani. We're going to pick Rakan. We're going to play for team fights. Wukong's coming in there in the top lane. We are specifically going to play for a Pays win condition for the first time in this entire series, and who would have thought? Pays is really good at League of Legends. When you play for him, he can actually do quite a lot for your team. Obviously, this is my favorite draft of JDG's of the entire series. Not only the Zeri, but the pick that I think is really going to go under the radar is the Akali in the mid lane. This is a brilliant pick. This destroys AL. Like, this makes it very difficult for them to ever play safe in the mid game, because you can just get free picks on Akali if they're going to play passive, and the longer this game goes, if they're going to have to play safe because of Akali, if you're going to sit in the back, then Zeri's going to scale up. If you try and punish Zeri, well, then you're likely going to have to trade getting Akali super fed, and obviously this is not a great position for AL to be in. I love this draft for JDG. I think it has so much setup and so much execution, and I think it puts a lot of the onus of responsibility on your 2 best players, which is what you should be doing in the playoffs. So credit to JDG, great draft. For AL, this is a crazy one. This is definitely, we're winning 2-1 in the series, and, you know, we're gonna see if it works in game number 4, because this was a weird one. Like, I get the Ziggs early on in the draft. I can understand why you think that that's a pretty consistent way to shut down what JDG has kind of shown that they want to do so far this year. You early draft Camille and Ziggs and just say, like, screw it, we're gonna, you know, try to punish you in the early game and just try to make it as easy as possible for us to scale out. The moment that Zeri comes in, this game becomes a lot more difficult. Obviously, you answer with something like Tristana to potentially have something in the late game, but you can't really punish Akali as Tristana. That's obviously not really something you can do. That's what makes Akali really good. And then River Shen on R5 for Tarzan. This is insane. I get the idea behind it in this comp because, again, you just kind of need to be everywhere if you're Tarzan pretty much at any point in time, because if either Zeri or Akali get super fed this game, you probably just instantly lose, and so you do kind of need to be available at all points in time. The problem is Shen himself is overvalued in the current meta. I've talked about this a lot in the LCK, where a lot of those teams were picking him up as a support and like a priority support for that in particular, because you could move around the map and play for side lanes so efficiently. I just don't think the champion's in that good of a spot. I think his numbers are a lot lower than a lot of the other primary tanks, and he doesn't really do enough damage to justify it. He can't skirmish as well as a lot of the other tanks, at least in pro right now. And I know Sejuani's not exactly like an ace in that regard, but I think JDG just generally have more to go off of this game, and they were able to punish that a lot more. Pays is going to get player of the game for me in the bot lane. They finally played for him, and he finally stepped up. He had honestly been getting outplayed by Hope through a majority of this series, not only just because Hope was getting a lot more resources than he was, but because Hope was just better. Like, Hope was playing really well. Not that Pays was like running it or anything, but Hope was definitely dominating a lot of these games, and Pays was not keeping up. He needed a game like this to come out and just win, to show like, yeah, you should be playing for me. If you invest those resources, I can give you what Hope has been giving AL on the other side of this matchup right now, and I can outplay him and I can outclass him, which is exactly what happened here. Missing was obviously great. Scout was really excellent. Shun looked very good on the Sejuani. I've always liked him on these facilitators because he plays them like Tarzan plays them, which is to say really aggro in the mid game. He tries to take a lot of these skirmishes. He uses Sejuani's natural combat power to push forward the game, to accelerate the pace, and I really like when junglers do that. Ala obviously was great on the top side as well, but this was Pays' game. Like, this is Zeri. This is Zeri gaming 101. Like, Missing was very good as a setup man, and I think he was obviously important towards this, but I'm not going to say it was a 1v9 with everybody else playing well, but this comp was always going to be about Zeri, and that's exactly what it was. And then for AL on the other side, they just didn't have the resources to be able to deal with that. Like I said, if either Zeri or Akali ever gets fed, ever gets out of control, even a little bit in this game, you're just doomed. Like, you have no way to ever come back from that, and that happened here. You know, Hope got mega outplayed. He's going to get dead of the game on the Zig. He was really useless. He did a lot of damage, but ignore the damage charts. It's Ziggs. Like, he's gonna top the damage charts. He wasn't doing anything of actual value throughout a lot of this game. Kale was bad once again. In both of their losses, Kale has actually not been particularly good. It's kind of been the same thing for Missing on the other side. Very uncharacteristic of Kale, though. Usually he looks very good in his team's losses, even going back to his time in the LCK. I'm not even entirely blaming the River Shen. Like, Tarzan wasn't horrific this game or anything. Flandre and Shanks were, I guess, generally fine, but there's just not really a lot of ways to be able to come back in this game when you lose in the early game, and that's exactly what we've been criticizing JDG for doing this entire series. So and here we are. It's game number 5 time. It's 2 apiece. Both teams have shown strengths. Both teams have definitely shown weaknesses. Either can come out on top. Now, obviously, AL having blue side is a pretty huge advantage, as we've seen throughout this series, but JDG has shown an innovation in drafting in game 4 that I think gives them at least something to work off of going into game number 5. As long as they don't revert to what they had been doing previously in the series, I think they have a real chance. But AL definitely still the team that is more complete, and we've seen that in this series. The pre-series analysis definitely still stands for both of these teams, but only one will be going to grand finals. One will be dropping to the semifinals. Who will it be? Well, the winner of game number 5 was anyone's legend. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and for the first time in their entire history, they will be moving to the finals of the LPL. I'm very excited for them. Obviously, this org has tried over and over again to put together a roster that comes even close to this kind of accomplishment, and they finally get it done here at the beginning of 2025. It's been no small secret that I've been a little bit excited about AL for basically their entire existence, even going back to when they were Rogue Warriors. I've always been a pretty big fan of this organization for having a decent eye for talent and just never really getting the results that I think they deserve. I was very vocal for many years about a player like Zhao Hao. Obviously, it goes even deeper than that. I've been critical of some of their decisions that I thought held back some of their better players, but a lot of people in the comment section of a lot of these LPL videos have always commented that I am too biased towards AL. Well, here you go. Here's them in the finals. I'm so excited to finally be able to say that about this organization, and They more than earned it. They more than earned it in this series. We'll just say that, because JD Gaming, they showed up to play here today. I think people have been really critical about the drafts of JDG in this series, and I think a lot of them are rightful. Like, you are correct in criticizing Game 1 and Game 3 because they are investing so much into a win condition that is so thwartable, quite frankly, by AL. I think they won the draft in Game 5. I know that seems like a crazy thing to say. I think both of these teams have a lot of ways to play this game out, but AL's win condition, for the most part, is Jinx. It's like protect Jinx with Lulu, with Galio, with Volibear, and just hope and pray that you're able to get enough gold onto that champion to be able to take over. Now you have the added luxury of having Flandre on the top side, who's going to be able to dominate on Aurora, regardless of the fact that she's not supposed to dominate in this comp. But generally speaking, when you're looking at this draft, this is a hyper carry comp. Like, they saw Paze just do it on Zeri, and they invested even more into it on the Jinx in this game number 5, and JDG, and they just have more options. They have more things that they can do, and I think theoretically their fights in the mid game should be better, and they scale really well as well. I honestly came out of this draft not thinking that JDG was in a really bad spot going into game number 5. I think the Bard pick on R5 was incredibly smart. I think it really does kind of make, specifically Volibear's life, a lot more difficult for Tarzan on the other side of this. I think, generally speaking, something like the Kennen could have a big impact. The problem for JDG just comes down to one simple thing, and it's that they got outplayed, that they weren't as good as AL on the other side of this matchup. Again, I'm not blaming draft for this game number 5 like everybody on Reddit seems to be. I think this was purely an execution diff, and I'm going to stick to that. I think player of the game and player of the series, to me, kind of has to go to Hope. Nobody was ever in contention for player of the series outside of him. If you wanted to give player of the game to Flandre on the top side for this Aurora game, I understand. If you wanted to give it to Kayle for the Lulu because of just how relevant and important that champion was towards this team's construction, I think that's also entirely fair. But to me, Hope was the main character of this series, and I think he came in clutch when this team needed him the most. He did that at Demacia Cup. He was arguably the best player at the entire tournament in the preseason. He was good in the regular season. He was good in the group stage. I'm not going to say he played poor by any means. He was surviving in 2v2s against, like, Jackie Love, and that's not an easy thing to do, but they didn't play for him nearly as much in the group stage. It kind of took them into this playoff run to really get back into playing for the bottom side of the map to make sure Paze didn't get out of control, and that's exactly what happened. I know people are critical of the misfortune, but generally speaking, MF should just be able to punish this lane really hard, especially with something like Bard moving around the map and creating a lot of havoc for specifically Volibear. He can't really come out and assist and try to get this Jinx fed, but yet, here we are. Like, Hope ends up getting strong in the late game. We end up getting to that part of the game where it's 5v5, and the Jinx goes untouched in these final fights, goes deathless in this game, and that's up to Hope, that's up to Kayle, and both of them I think were excellent. Again, I don't want to undersell how good Kayle was here. Even if he wasn't super consistent in their losses, he still had a really good series overall. Flandre had the best game of the series for him here in game number 5 on the Aurora, just mega gapped Ale. Again, I don't even think this is like a champion problem. I think Aurora is strong, but I think Kennen is in a good position to be useful this game. Boy, Ale sucked on the other side of this, and boy, Flandre was really freaking good in game number 5. He has been the best top laner in the LPL so far in 2025. I don't even think that's all that debatable right now. With as good as Bin has been as well. Like, I'm not even trying to say that Bin has been awful. It's just that Flandre has been so good. Tarzan was awesome here on the Volibear. Not an easy Volibear game, and Shanks was mostly protect here on the Galio. This was a team effort for AL, but Hope was the main character of this team, and I'm really excited to say that. And then for JDG on the other side, they just were worse. Like, there's nothing else to say. If Paze and Scout don't pop off, this team isn't going to be able to win. It really has become that clear for me, and I think I have some concerns about them going into the lower part of the bracket now, regardless of if they face Bilibili Gaming or Top Esports, whoever wins the series later on in the video. I'm not exactly sure I'm walking out of this series feeling better about JD Gaming, because I do think they got exposed a bit. AL put a lot of pressure into winning in the bot lane 2v2, and JDG had no real answer to that, and I think, obviously, part of that is the fact that the rest of the map struggled. I'm not blaming Paze in particular for this, but what is becoming clear is that if you take Paze out of the game for JDG, they're not as good, and that should be pretty obvious, but man, it is like really apparent. Ale is going to get dud of the game here for game number 5. This Kennen game was completely unacceptable. I mean, just actively the worst player in the entire game by a really large margin. These are the big moments that you need Ale to step up in. This is why you brought him in the offseason in the first place, and he's getting mega outplayed by the guy you brought him in to replace. It's just a bad look for him in general. This was an awful game number 5 for him. Shun really struggled on the Viego in this one. Just didn't really have any prio or pressure. This should be a game where he does have quite a bit of that in the mid game. Like I said, Pays was never able to get out of control. Missing wasn't nearly as active as I wanted him to be on the Bard. This should be like an Omega pick with this draft, especially going into AL's comp. You should have full priority in the middle of the game to win every skirmish that you want to take. That should be the perfect thing that JDG wants to set up for, and yet it just didn't really happen. Missing wasn't aggressive enough on it. Scout was not very good throughout a majority of this series. Games 1 and 3 were genuinely awful from him. Like, there are real things that this JD Gaming team has to fix. Now, they still have very easy win conditions. If Shun or Scout or Pays get really far ahead, they're gonna win that game because those guys are so good at playing from leads. But if you can shut them down, if you can force this team to try to play out of a neutral game state, sometimes that's gonna be a little bit tricky for them to do, especially if Pays in particular doesn't have a lot of resources, and I think that was really exposed in this series. So JDG dropping down now to the lower bracket finals, the semifinals. They're still only one series off from getting their rematch with AL, but it's anyone's legend moving on to the grand finals. This team is still undefeated in best of series in 2025. Even going back to preseason tournaments, they have looked unstoppable so far this year, and honestly, there aren't a lot of reasons to believe that they could be anything other than LPL champions in just a couple of days. But that's going to bring us to our lower bracket matchup of today's video, our 4th place matchup, if you really want to call it that. This is the qualifying series for that semifinals. We'll see who gets to take on JD Gaming for a chance to get themselves into the grand finals to meet anyone's legend. Of course, it's a matchup between two teams that have had certainly their ups and downs, but a lot more ups than downs for the most part over the course of this year. It's the number 2 seed from Group C in Bilibili Gaming, taking on the number 2 seed from Group A in Top Esports. Obviously, both of these teams losing a best of 5 in the group stage to get themselves in this position in the first place. One of those is significantly more understandable than the other, considering the context we've seen from the rest of these playoffs. All of a sudden, Top Esports losing to anyone's legend doesn't seem nearly as bad as Bilibili losing to ThunderTalk. Bilibili obviously got their revenge by beating ThunderTalk and knocking them out of the playoffs in the previous round, but both of these teams very much still have something to prove. They were the two big favorites, at least for me, going into the year, and to know that one of them will be out in 4th place basically no matter what is definitely an intriguing proposition, and I think both teams have a lot to fight over here in terms of reputation, kind of just getting back on track. Confidence is on the line. Even if you aren't a team that wants to go to first stand and spend all this time and energy going to an international tournament and, you know, doing all of that right in the middle of the winter split so early on into the year, I know some teams are a little bit scared of that. Even if you don't want to do that, like, this is still one of those series that you want to come out and prove that you can beat one of the other top teams in the entire league that is trying their absolute hardest to stay alive. And I think there's reasons to believe in both teams in this series. BLG is going to be coming into this as favorites for me. I'm certainly expecting them to be able to walk out of this series with a victory, and most of that just comes down to the fact that Knight has still been really, really good for this team. Oh boy, did he smash Satab in the previous series. It actually wasn't even funny how lopsided that series ended up being versus ThunderTalk because Knight just completely took over and completely dominated. We've been waiting for him to get back into form, but I think very similarly to the conversations that I've had about Chovy for a lot of this year over in the LCK, we misconstrued bad performance with team performance a lot of the times when it comes to players like Knight. You kind of just expect their teams to be really good because all of their teams have been really good. Knight has never not performed in the LPL. He's basically been like a top tier player from day number 1, and he's kind of grown into somebody that you can just expect to see in the LPL finals every single year. And so when BLG drops a series to a team like ThunderTalk in the regular season, you naturally assume that it must be Knight's play decreasing, because if Knight was playing perfect, then he would be having the same results that he's had recently. But I certainly don't think Knight has been the problem for this team. I think it's been very clear what the problem is, and quite frankly, it's their one, like, halfway new addition, and that's Wei in the jungle, who's just not really been good enough so far in 2025. Now, I think a lot of that has less to do with Wei individually as a player, and a lot to do with the fact that he just does not click at times with the rest of the players on this team. It is not at all like what happened when Wei came in 2024. It very much felt at the time like a lot of the BLG players were okay with shifting their mentalities and shifting their play styles to be more accommodating, we'll just say, of Wei, who is a lot slower paced of a player, somebody who wants to play a lot more for scaling in 5v5 team fights than the rest of this BLG team. When Shun was in, they were playing fast and aggressive. If they didn't have a gigantic lead at 15 minutes, something went horribly wrong for them last year, because that was just the style, and I think that really benefited certain players, specifically Elkin On in the bot lane, who looked amazing with that style because they were so good at dominating 2v2. They were the best laners in the world, quite frankly, in terms of the 2v2, that they were able to just completely dominate. Elk in particular really emerging in that regard. But once Wei came in, it became a lot more about slowing the pace down and playing for team fights, which, yes, does play more towards your solo laners, does play to Bin's strength, in my opinion. It plays to Knight's strength because he's good in every phase of the game, but I think you're taking away some of that magic factor that Elk and On had, and there have been a lot of reports behind the scenes that On and Wei don't necessarily view the game the same way, and that there have been conflicts at BLG because of those, ideological differences about League of Legends, and if that's the case, that's a huge issue for BLG that they're going to have to overcome. I've always been lower on Wei. I've always kind of been, more on the pushback of him being like an elite caliber jungler. I started to get convinced at times last year. He gets benched at Worlds because they don't like the playstyle, but it's really not clicking right now in 2025, and that's going to be a big determining factor because top esports just don't have that kind of major weakness. They have inconsistent players for sure. Crisp is the kind of player that can run it down any game. You can point to literally any series of all time and you'll find one moment where Crisp runs it down. It happens, right? It's just the kind of player he is, but you have to learn to live with that because the good moments that he gives you, they're almost better than almost anybody else in the world. The unique angles that he gives you are phenomenal, and I think that there is a world where he is just more active than someone like On in this series, and I certainly have really liked the way that Top Esports has played through the middle of the map to start 2025. Cream has been spectacular. He took a big leap last year in terms of a well-rounded game. He's always been a really good carry player back on OMG On, Akali and Silas and, a lot of these melee assassin champions that, quite frankly, the Zeka mold that we talk about a lot. Some players are really good at melee mids. Cream was always that, but I think he expanded his game so much in 2024 to be a much better facilitator and to be really good, at being able to shove and roam and play for jungle that I think it turned him into one of the scarier mid laners in the world. He was awesome in 2024, and I think he might be even better right now in 2025 because he's being given more responsibility in the mid lane to honestly be this team's primary carry in a lot of options. I've been very impressed with Cream. He's got a lot in store for today because it's him versus Knight. He's going to have to step up. He's going to have to be, the best version of himself if Top Esports want to be able to survive in this series, but I think one of the big encouraging traits for TES is that Cream has been so good. I think 369 needs to really start locking in and getting back to what he was in spring of last year rather than what he was in summer of last year. It's like a tale of two players. He's not really gotten that form back. I was calling him the best top laner in the world in spring, and he's just completely fallen away from that ever since the beginning of summer last year. Kanavi's been good, maybe not great. He's been very above average, and I think that that's obviously really solid. His early games are still exceptional. He's not been the MVP Kanavi that I was kind of expecting, but he's definitely been better than Wei on the other side. I think really when you're talking about this matchup in particular, it's really going to come down to mid lane. If Knight can dominate and be the best player on the Rift and, be the better mid laner, then I think it's going to be really hard for Top Esports to find ways back in because I don't think Jackie Love is going to be able to completely outskill Elk. I don't think 369 is going to be able to completely outskill Bin. These are places that I think Bilibili is just better, but if the middle of the map can actually go Top Esports' favor, and I think a lot of that comes down to Kanavi as well, if you can get a lot of momentum and a lot of tempo through the middle of the map, if Cream is playing really well and Kanavi is better than Wei, that's the avenue for Top Esports to win these games. And so I'm very excited. I'm very interested. Of course, Bilibili is the favorite for me going into this, but anybody can win it, and the only way to know how things go is, of course, to go game by game. So let's get into game number one. The winner of game number one was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number one in this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and it's off the back of a really straightforward comp. Now, both of these drafts, I think, are very straightforward. They're very, engage heavy. You have so many different ways to be able to start and facilitate 5v5s if you want to play front to back, or if you want to try and find picks for your pseudo-assassin, whether it be Akali for Top Esports or Aurora for Bilibili Gaming to try and flank the backside. There are so many different ways for both of these teams to do their thing. They just do them at different times. What really tipped Bilibili over the edge and what kind of allowed them to get going is that the mid game is just so important right now, and you had Xin Zhao Ezreal, which I think is one of the harder duos to deal with in these mid game 3v3 or 4v4 skirmishes. If you're able to get them, going and try to get those two out of control, it's very difficult to deal with, and then eventually Aurora gets online and the Rumble gets online, and both of those champions are dealing a ton of damage, and the game just becomes too difficult to win if you're Top Esports. I'm not blaming the draft entirely. I do think it all just comes down to whether or not they can survive these 3v3s, get through the mid game, because I do think they scale better from a neutral position. If you are just talking about straight up 5v5s, I don't think BLG has enough damage to ever like fully break through this like Sejuani and Bessorel front line with Akali like flanking your Ezreal and, you know, trying to keep him honest the entire time. Corki's going to do a ton of damage. Like, there are tons of ways for Top Esports to win this the later the game goes, but again, it never got there because Bilibili just did a really good job of capitalizing on their advantages. Knight is going to get player of the game for me here. I think this is up in the air. You want to give this to Elk? Sure. You want to give this to Bin? Sure. You want to give this to On? Sure. I think basically anybody other than Wei, no disrespect to Wei, just he didn't play bad. I just don't think he was player of the game worthy. I'm giving it tonight because the Aurora damage is just so ridiculous to watch, and we talked about just how important he is towards BLG's success. Again, if you wanted to give this to one of the other carries, I think that that's fair. There's no real one individual player for me that stood out significantly more than the rest of them. I think basically all of them all kind of did what they were supposed to do, if that makes sense. I know that that's a gross oversimplification, but, you know, Knight was able to capitalize and pick off priority targets in the late game. Bin was dropping ultimates and doing a ton of damage, ended up, I think, second in the entire game on the damage charts. Elk was first in the damage charts because he was controlling the mid game, and his prio and pressure alongside the Xin Zhao and the Alistar is what allowed them to play so greedy in the mid game. Like, everybody just kind of did their own thing. They did what they were supposed to do. This was a good team victory for Bilibili Gaming, and I'm hoping to see more of that moving forward. And then for Top Esports, you just have to get more control over the middle of the map. We talked about this. I'm not expecting bot lane to come out and dominate because Elk and On are so good, and quite frankly, they're so unpunishable for the most part. At least they have been over the past year, and I do not expect 369 to be better than Bin. That's just not even something that I'm considering, right? Like, 369's not even been on that level when he is playing well. Bin has always been a bit of a kryptonite for 369, and so I'm expecting the middle of the map to matter so much for Top Esports, and they just were the worst part of the team for TES here. Cream was fine, I guess, generally speaking, on the Akali. This is one of his signature champions, and to play this in game one against Knight and just not be the better mid laner is definitely a bit frustrating, but Kanavi has to be better. He's going to get dead of the game here on the Sejuani. He is way too influential towards this team's success and whether or not they're going to be relevant in this series to be as uninfluential as he was on Sejuani. I don't even know if I really like Sejuani game number one. I like it in terms of the team comp fit that you ended up drafting around, and you wanted to take that away from, you know, Bilibili. I understand that you probably didn't want to let Wei have that in this series and in game number one here, but I want to see Kanavi on something he can actually run the early game on, because that's what he does really well. That's what Top Esports has done really well so far this year. So if that's my main criticism, hopefully they can come out and fix it, but it's just game number one. Kanavi obviously has the ability to be better moving into the second or third game in the series, but they do kind of have to win game two. Winning 3 games in a row against Bilibili is not easy if you're down 2-0. Winning games 3, 4, and 5 is just too big of a challenge. I think you have to win this game 2 to stay alive in this series, and BLG, if you can get that 2-0 lead, boy, what a fantastic position that would be. You've already started to look so much better over the course of this playoff run. If you can start 2-0 against Top Esports, that's really going to cement it. But is that going to happen, or is Top Esports going to be able to even things up? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series here at 1 apiece. And yeah, blue side's still pretty strong. I think we can definitely conclude that after the first couple of series that we've seen in the LPL. We already knew that from the LCK, but it continues to really show dividends here. I think generally this is just a draft masterclass from Top Esports, understanding what is working so far for them, what worked for Bilibili in game number 1, and what's worked for Top Esports so far in the playoffs in particular, what's gotten them across a lot of the teams that they played into, which is specifically mid-game power spikes. It's kind of the opposite of what we criticized JD Gaming for. They were playing so heavily for trying to win early. It's the same thing for Top Esports, but when it is done in a way where you have champions that specifically make it hard for BLG to answer a lot of these challenges, then all of a sudden things do open up a bit more. I think this is a lot more similar, I'll just say, to like a game 5 JDG draft than it is like a game 1 or game 3 JDG draft, even if I do think that the outcome and the goal is kind of similar, which is let's win all of our lanes, let's win mid-game team fights, and hope this game doesn't go long enough for the Kai'Sa to really destroy us, for Maokai to become unkillable as a frontline tank when we don't really have a lot of ways to break through him. That being said, they still have a Xayah, they still have a Viego. It's not like they get bad in the late game, just I think BLG eventually gets there. Their mid game is just so ridiculous, though. They have so many tools, so many options. Of course, Rakan and Jace are a big reason why that is the case, especially because Jace actually did get strong in this game. We finally saw a pro game where Jace looked really good in the early game, punished a lane matchup that he absolutely should be able to punish. Rakan was super active. This was a great game from Crisp, a gigantic support gap in this one in favor of Top Esports, which is ginormous towards their success. But at the end of the day, it was a very easy player of the game choice. It's going to Cream in the mid lane. We've talked it over on this channel many times already in this video. We've said it 100 times. When Cream pops off for Top Esports, they are very tough to beat. When he is their #1 option in games like this, I don't think BLG can beat them. Like, I genuinely think if Cream comes out and is just better than Knight in any game in this series, then that's probably just an instantaneous win for Top Esports. And he got Silas, and he really was able to take over. Obviously, this is kind of the peril of early picking Maokai, because you basically open up the door for Silas to come in and just make your life a living hell. Wei was never going to be all that relevant in this game because the Silas was just going to be a better version of him, essentially, do a lot more damage and be more relevant in the mid game. It's exactly what happened. Knight, you know, the Yone is something that I'm really intrigued by. People are first picking this very consistently in a lot of drafts. I think a lot of teams see this as very versatile, something that can fit into a lot of different comps. You can use it as primary engage or secondary engage options. You can get a lot of picks from it. You can play for late game team fights. You can play for mid game power spikes. Like, I can understand the idea why teams are so comfortable first picking Yone, but we have consistently seen it kind of falter in these matchups where the enemy mid laner just has better options available to them. And in this case, it was the Silas just kind of being able to go wherever he wanted on the map, and it very much was a problem for BLG. Now, again, a lot of the early game, mid game problems that BLG is running into is because Maokai is just not good this game. This is a really greedy Maokai pick with all of the things up in Fearless that were up, and Top Esports very much punished that. Cream was a big part of it, but he's still awesome on Silas. Again, I want to go back to that funny Reddit thing I saw from last week where I saw somebody say that Cream was a Tristana one trick. I just, you know, shout out the Reddit community, shout out the LPL community. You gotta love the people who watch these games. But credit to Cream, he's been playing excellently across this whole year, and if he's gonna step up like this in big moments and be better than Knight, that's a problem for Bilibili. Kanavi was really good here, and, you know, like I said, 369 and Crisp were excellent. Jaculov has not really been that guy so far in 2025. He hasn't had to be. You know, Cream has definitely taken more of a primary carry option, and Jaculov has just been kind of along for the ride, we'll just say, with the rest of this team, but it's totally fine. If you're going to put your bot lane on a back burner, if your top laner is going to be in a matchup that he can win 1v1, 369 is good enough to win these matchups. And if you can invest a lot of your resources into the middle of the map, that's the way to win for TES. And then for Bilibili on the other side, like, you just can't have performances like this. I already talked about how the Maokai was super punished, but this is a very late game draft. Like, you're playing for Kai'Sa, Yone, Maokai, Jax out. And I just don't know if I love that against a team in Top Esports that has so much momentum and, generally speaking, has things like Silas and Jace early on in the draft. I guess you were maybe trying to capitalize in the way that AL did earlier against JD Gaming, but like I said, I think the Silas is so much stronger in the context of this game than it was at any point, you know, any of those mid lane picks were for JDG when they were picking things like Azir early on in drafts. That adding on to the fact that a couple of your players just played bad, I think really made this game difficult. Dead of the game is pretty obviously going to go to On. A major support gap here. On gets what I would consider to be his signature champion. I've always associated him most with the Blitzcrank, and he pulls it out here in game 2. Not a traditionally great On Blitzcrank game. That I'm definitely willing to say this was not particularly good. Elk was not very good this game on the Kai'Sa. We've seen Kai'Sa really dominate a lot of games globally so far this year. Not a good performance from Elk. I already talked about Wei not being good. Bin was completely shut down, mostly due to the matchup. I'm not even entirely blaming him. This is how this is supposed to go. Jack should not really be able to play this all that easily throughout any part of the early game, and if this game goes 26 minutes, yeah, he's never getting the chance to be online. Knight was the only relevant member of BLG, and even then, like, Cream was more relevant on the other side. This was kind of a slaughter in favor of Top Esports, and BLG is gonna have to bounce back, but it's 1-1, and you've got side control if you're BLG. You're going back to blue side here, even if blue side wins every game. That means you win game 5, and so you feel pretty good about that. You just don't want to drop this game number 3, then things can start to get a little bit scary, and for Top Esports, you'd love to win a game here on red side. You'd love to be able to assert that this was, you know, more of a planning diff than it was just a blue side win. I'd love to see that come out of Top Esports, but as I've already said, 1-1 means that game 3 becomes the most important game in the series, so both of these teams are going to be ramped up. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Top Esports, they are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up for the first time in this series, 2-1. And can I even say that they won this game? They end up destroying the Nexus, down 2.5k gold. They got completely obliterated throughout basically the entirety of this. Bin runs into the enemy base as they're sieging it, just completely instant away, dies, loses his team the team fight, loses his team the game, and BLG lose. Like, what was that? What was this game? How was it even possible for Top Esports to have walked out of this with a victory? I don't even know. This should have been genuinely impossible. There were really, really good plays made by a couple of the members of Top Esports, but even looking at the draft, there's really no reason to believe that this ever should have been a game that Top Esports had a chance of winning, let alone from the gold deficit they had. They were down. Legitimately, they must have been like 9-10k gold at some point in this game. Like I said, even destroying the Nexus, they're down 1.5k gold, and that's absolutely ridiculous. Like, it's genuinely absurd how they ended up winning this. For Bilibili, how do you lose this? How do you throw this away? Bin, what are you doing? What is happening with the Cassante? He sees a low health Varus or a half health Varus clearing wave in base, and he's just like, I guess I'll go and kill. He dies for that, doesn't even kill the Varus. Now all of a sudden, a 4v5 is actually winnable by a Top Esports team that has scaled at least a little bit with some major objectives from dragons and things like that. And so you're sitting in a spot where Cream is able to completely pop off in a team fight or two and absolutely win the game for Top Esports, and now you've lost from basically an unlosable position for players like Bin and Knight and Elk. That death in that final team fight that they had was their only one of the entire game. That's how genuinely dominant BLG was up until that point, and yet they couldn't walk away with a victory. Absurd stuff, and you gotta give credit to the resilience and the understanding of Top Esports to say, hey, we took one fight, we can actually end the game. We can win the game off of literally one team fight win, and they did exactly that. They had 2 kills before that fight, and they still were like, yeah, we can instantly end the game. Great stuff from them. How do you not give player of the game to Cream? I mean, he played that final fight so beautifully, and honestly, he did a great job of keeping Top Esports alive for the entire game. Up until that point, he is just playing fantastic in such an important series. I really do think that we're going to see the emergence of Cream this year. I really do think he's going to kind of show up and be one of the best mid laners in the world. He has been so far, and I think that that is going to be something that continues. His consistency is incredible. I think the Ariane R5 is almost one of the only picks I think you can actually take here and feel comfortable with, even if I don't love Top Esports draft, mostly because I think you're relying so much on trying to get specific win conditions to work, where, again, I think Bilibili just has so many more options. Not only do I think the Lilia is gigantic in this game, and I genuinely do not understand the Shyvana pick to, like, my core. I really do not get what it's supposed to do in this draft. But even if I didn't believe that Lilia could just run the early game and make things easier, BLG scales better. You have more options in the back half of this game. Obviously, they have a Shyvana, but you have a Sivir. Like, you have Talia, you have Lilia. You have so many tools in the back half of this game to be able to really kind of make things a little bit easier for you. There should be no justification behind you losing a major fight in the back half of the game other than your top laner completely running it down. So credit to Cream, like, all of this to say he played really well, and I want to give him, a lot of praise. And honestly, praise to Kanavi. Give a lot of credit to Kanavi. I don't think this is a good Shyvana game. I think Shyvana is playable in this meta. I certainly think that there are avenues for you to be able to utilize her. This is not the draft that I think really gets the most out of Shyvana. It's certainly not the matchup. Lilia, like, notoriously punishes Shyvana, at least in my opinion, from my experience. That matchup is awful for the Dragon because you just have no way to contest in the mid game ever, and that's what happened here. There was a gigantic lead for BLG because Kanavi never had prio or pressure in the jungle at all. Wei actually had a really good game on the Lilia, and yet Kanavi was still so relevant in these final team fights at being able to deal a ton of damage because the game actually did go 35 minutes, which was huge. I'm not going to praise the rest of this team. Chris got caught out a bunch of times. Jackie Love was awful. He's actually going to get my dud of the game here for game number 3. Again, I'm worried about Jackie. He's really not been that great this year. He's not been bad by any means, but like, average Jackie Love is, like, really disappointing, quite frankly, and I'm expecting more of him. He just has not been traditional Jackie Love, and I've been a huge Jackie Love defender over the past couple of years. I gave him my MVP in 2023 when he missed Worlds. Like, that's how much I believed in Jackie Love as a player that year, but it's just not happening right now. 369 was not nearly relevant enough on the Gnar, even if he did do some interesting things in terms of teleport flanks later on in the game. There are things to talk about, I guess, when it comes to Top Esports, but at the end of the day, this was gifted to them by Bilibili. Like, this is Bilibili Bilibili's fault. This was their game to lose, and they gave it on a silver platter over to Top Esports. What do you even want me to say? Do you want me to criticize Bin for going into the base? I'm sure he knows. I'm sure everybody who watched the game knows that that was a gigantic mistake. On missed a couple of crucial stuns on Leona in the later fight. Like, that's a problem. Elk wasn't doing enough damage on the Sivir. That's a problem. Like, Knight, Wei, like, everybody was good up until that point. That's the frustrating part. Bin was having a great game. Wei was doing a phenomenal job. Wei would have easily been player of the game for me on the Lilia if things had gone even remotely okay, because he was playing really well, but alas, they throw it away, and now they're one game away from not only losing this series in 4, but being eliminated from the playoffs. If this is the game that leads to your elimination, like, that's a mental boom of the century for a defending champion. You have to win this game number 4, in my opinion, and for Top Esports, you have been gifted a series lead. Do not throw it away. Do not blow it. If you can close this out in 4, that is a massive, massive coup for them. So are they going to be able to do it? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to take this series 3-1, and they will be moving on to the semifinals to meet up with JD Gaming. And Bilibili, on the other hand, our defending back-to-back LPL champions, the team that dominated the LPL last year, that made it to game 5 of the World Finals, is out in 4th place in the Winter's Split. Genuinely absurd how the wheels have just completely fallen off for BLG. The fact that they ended up losing this series in the way that they did definitely doesn't help because, you know, obviously game 4 was what it was. Top Esports was better. I think they had the better draft in this game. I think they have clear direction, and I think they executed on it well, but BLG losing that game number 3, that's what set this up. That's the only reason we're here in the first place, and that was entirely their fault. They have so many things that I do think they need to work out that they have yet to figure out. I think that there are a couple of individual players that are underperforming, and we'll talk about that, but this is not the same BLG team. I genuinely think losing Shun might have destroyed the chemistry on this roster, and I think that that's a very scary sentence for BLG fans. But let's talk about Top Esports first and foremost. Player of the game here in Game 4 is going to go to Jackie Love. Boy, did I need to see this kind of performance from Jackie Love. I have really kind of been waiting to see a breakout, pop-off, dominating Jackie Love performance in 2025. He's been good, not great. He's just kind of been there, and, you know, he had his problems in Game 3. He wasn't necessarily looking all that dominant before this in the playoffs. It had really been the middle of the map that had really expressed a lot of the positives for Top Esports up until this point, but here we are. Jackie Love dominating in game number 4, looking really good against both Elk and On, and the Ashe just generally being a very important part of what I would consider to be like a surprisingly good 5v5 comp. I know you don't look at Nocturne Orianna and go like, they're gonna rock these team fights, they're gonna dominate. You expect picks, you expect them to be able to try and, you know, get a lot of these weird advantages, but I actually think this is a really good draft because it gives you so many different outs. And I think one of those for Top Esports actually is team fights. I know, you know, ball on Nocturne, go get a pick, like, I get it, right? But the Kennen engage, the Renata ultimate, the Nocturne diving onto the backline, you could just do a regular shockwave. Like, you have plenty of ways to just absolutely decimate a 5v5 in this instance, and BLG is severely lacking in ways to win 5v5s, and we'll talk about that with their draft. But I've really grown to like Nocturne Orianna in this meta. I know I've been kind of anti-Nocturne in the past on this channel, specifically at Worlds this past year, but I think it's a very different game right now than it was at Worlds this past year, and I think Nocturne is a much better spot to actually be able to do a lot of things, even if the champion himself is not all that different. I think the game is different enough where Nocturne is actually much more valuable. It specifically punishes things like Vi that are going to be a little bit more straightforward in terms of how they want to play the game, so credit to Kanavi, thought he played well. Jackie Love is great, but player of the series as a whole, come on, you knew this was coming. It's going to Cream in the mid lane. How could it possibly go to anybody else? He was the best player on the Rift in this series. He was too important to Game 2. Obviously, he was important to Game 3, regardless of if you want to say that he was the most valuable player in that game or whatever. But he was awesome here in Game 4 as well on the Orianna. He was doing a ridiculous amount. He led the team in KP percentage as Orianna. It's really great stuff. Cream is really starting to emerge as like not just one of the best mid laners in the LPL, but like one of the best mid laners in the world, like borderline top 5 in the world right now, like a top 10 player in the world kind of player. That's where Cream has been at so far in 2025. I'm really happy to be able to say that. You know, we talk about it a lot. He was the first official channel darling of Super K-Man Rocks back in 2022, I want to say, like many years ago. It was like right after he stopped being Crime and he became Cream for OMG. It's so crazy to see him now topping like the damage charts in a playoff series against BLG on Top Esports. It's really fun to see. Crisp was really good in this series. I think he's going to get a bit undervalued because of that Poppy game and I guess kind of game number 1, but games 2 and 4 were excellent. You know, 369 did exactly what he was supposed to do, which was not lose on the top side. Overall, this was a good series for Top Esports, and you know what? Group A looked like it was incredibly strong. Anyone's Legend is sitting in the finals. Who's to say Top Esports isn't bare minimum the second best team in the LPL right now with this kind of win? And for BLG on the other side, like I already talked about it, but there are just so many things you have to fix. This was a bad draft and a bad game. You drafted a comp that really wants to set up for an AD carry to come in and really pop off, and you drafted Jhin. I like Jhin, and I like Galio plus Vi and things like that separately. Together, they don't really make a lot of sense in my brain. You drafted a Zeri comp and then picked Jhin. Like, I just don't really understand what exactly the goal was in this one. I think On really struggled in this series. I think Wei, who's getting my dead of the game for game 4, really struggled in this series, and it all really comes down to that, huh? We talk about it a lot. There are all those rumors. Wei and On are opposite players. They view the game completely differently, and they don't really like playing with each other. Well, that's kind of coming through, like, in terms of the gameplay. On is not playing well. He's playing way worse than he was last year, and I already thought his 2024 was worse than his 2023, and Wei has been kind of a disaster in terms of the jungle position for Bilibili at the start of this year, even with players like Knight playing well. I think Elk has been fine. Bin has been good at the start of this year, even if he wasn't particularly good in this series. Like, there are other avenues for you to be able to win games, but if Wei and On are not going to be able to click and connect in that jungle support position, you are just going to be worse than you were last year. You're going to cap out at the 4th or 3rd best team in the LPL. And if that's the case for Bilibili, coming off of a year where they dominated the LPL, where they went to MSI finals, where they went to World finals, if you're going to be the 3rd or 4th best team, only changing like half of a member from last year, like that's got to be one of the biggest disappointments you could possibly draw up. It's just unacceptable if that's going to be the case. There are so many things this BLG team needs to work on, but they have time to work on it now because they're done. Their season is over. They will have to wait until spring. Top Esports is, of course, moving on to face JD Gaming. We'll talk about that a bit when we talk about the bracket, but I'm happy for this team. I feel like a lot of people have counted out TES. I think a lot of people looked at this roster as a strict downgrade from last year, losing Tion, losing Mako, and getting Kanavi and Crisp. Yeah, you lost your 2 best players, but you got some pretty damn good replacements for them, and it's still a really, really great core on this team, and I think Top Esports is proving to a lot of people that they probably underestimated them going into the year. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Round 3 and Round 4 overview and analysis video of the winter playoffs. Up on the screen, the updated bracket. Only 3 teams remain. Anyone's Legend gets that free pass into the finals by winning the winners finals. Meeting them will be the winner of JD Gaming and Top Esports, a very fun matchup that we will preview right now. I really do think that there are a lot of things to look at in this series, but none more important than Cream versus Scout. Again, I think the middle of the map matters so much. I think Kanavi versus Shun is a very important matchup for this series. I think, you know, theoretically we could be seeing Pays versus Jackie Love matter a ton, but I think they're more the products of the rest of the team. Jungle mid is going to determine which one of these 2 teams comes out on top, and I think it's really up to you who you think is going to be in an advantageous position there. Do you think Shun's got more mechanical talent than Kanavi, or do you think Kanavi has better early pathing and can take advantage of Shun's weaknesses? Do you think that Scout is a better overall player than Cream, or do you think that the form that Cream is in puts him on the same level as Scout, somebody that can, you know, go toe-to-toe with him? He just beat Knight in a best of 5. Like, there are so many factors that I think go in to that calculation. I think when I look at some of the rest of the rosters right now, it's very difficult for me to bet against Top Esports. I really do believe Group A was just the group of death. Like, AL and TES were just both so strong, and I think that was the Demacia Cup finals. I think it's going to be the finals again here. I find this series to be very intriguing, and I think it will be close. I think there is a chance for JDG to come out on top, but honestly, my prediction is Top Esports 3-1. I think this is closer to being a 4-game set than it is to being, like, in favor of JDG. Now, I always do that 1-game spread. My spread would be Top Esports 3-1, Top Esports 3-2. I think it's closer to being a 3-2 than it is to being a 3-0 or anything like that. I don't think TES are those kinds of favorites, at least from my expectations, but I do think they are favorites going into this series, not only because of momentum, but because their only series losses this year have been to AL, who have proven to be maybe the best team in the LPL. So we'll have to wait and see. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that takedown in the comment section below, but that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of the LPL playoffs, but we've been covering all of the other major regions as well. The LTA and the LCK are done and dusted. You can check out all of the videos on their entire winter split on this channel, and the LEC videos are going to be out later on this week to cover everything that's been going on there, and we'll follow that all to First Stand, where we'll be covering every single game at the first big international tournament. If you're interested in that, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all